To the seasoned fighter aces of the Luftwaffe patrolling the freezing skies over Italy, unescorted American bombers were little more than flying targets. They scoffed at the clumsy, glass-nosed B-25s, lumbering through the clouds, diving out of the blinding sun with 20mm cannons blazing. For months, it was a slaughter, a one-sided game of cat and mouse, where the predators always won. But absolute arrogance has a funny way of blinding a man to his own demise. When they dropped from the clouds expecting the usual frantic scattering, they had no idea their fragile prey had just grown iron teeth. Wind howled through the shattered plexiglass of the B-25 Mitchell's nose, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of hydraulic fluid and burnt cordite. Captain Alva Donovan fought the heavy yoke, his forearms burning with lactic acid as he forced the crippled bomber toward the dirt runway of Alisane Airfield in Corsica. The aircraft, affectionately dubbed Carolina Reaper, was a flying sieve. 2 feet of the left vertical stabilizer was completely gone, sheared off by a 20mm cannon shell, and the right R-2600 twin cyclone engine was trailing a thick, oily plume of black smoke. "Gear down, Sammy," Donovan barked over the crackling intercom, his voice hoarse from 2 hours of shouting over the roar of wind and failing machinery. First Lieutenant Samuel Hayes, a kid from Ohio who looked too young to be shaving, let alone flying combat missions over fascist Italy, threw the lever. "Gear down, Artie. 3 green lights. We're coming in hot. Keep her steady," Donovan muttered, easing the throttles back. The B-25 hit the pierced steel planking of the runway hard, bouncing once before the brakes squealed in protest, kicking up a massive cloud of red Mediterranean dust. As the bomber finally ground to a halt near the revetments, the crash wagons and ambulances were already racing toward them, sirens wailing. Donovan unbuckled his harness, his hands trembling slightly, a post-adrenaline reaction he hated but couldn't control. He ripped off his leather flight helmet and climbed down into the crawlway. In the nose compartment, medic teams were already carefully extracting the bombardier. First Lieutenant David Miller. Miller was pale, his flight suit soaked in crimson. A piece of shrapnel from a frontal attack had punched straight through the fragile greenhouse nose, finding flesh and bone. "He'll make it, Captain," one of the medics said, seeing the grim look on Donovan's face. "Lost a lot of juice, but the artery is intact." Donovan nodded silently, stepping out onto the hot Corsican dirt. He watched them load his friend into the back of the olive-drab ambulance. This was the 3rd time in a month a bombardier or navigator had been chewed up in the nose of his aircraft. The 340th Bombardment Group was bleeding, and the wound was entirely tactical. The problem was simple, yet seemingly unsolvable. The B-25 C and D models they were flying were designed for medium-altitude level bombing. They had a single, flexible, 30 caliber machine gun in the glass nose. Against Japanese Zeros in the Pacific, that might have been a minor deterrent. But here, over the rugged terrain of Italy, they were facing the hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe. Specifically, they were facing Hauptmann Dieter Kessler. 300 miles north, at a grass airstrip tucked away in the Po Valley, Kessler sat in a canvas chair outside the dispersal hut, savoring the bitter taste of Italian espresso. He was a striking man in his late 20s, possessing the kind of sharp, aristocratic features that Goebbels' propaganda ministry adored. His leather flight jacket was worn perfectly at the elbows, and around his neck hung the Knight's Cross. Kessler watched with a satisfied smirk as his ground crew painted another white hash mark on the rudder of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. It was his 42nd confirmed victory. "Another American?" asked Lieutenant Erich Brandt, Kessler's youthful wingman, leaning against the wooden frame of the hut. "A Mitchell," Kessler replied smoothly, lighting a cigarette. "They are stubborn, I will give them that. But they are tactically blind. They fly in those tight little boxes, thinking their top and tail gunners will save them." Kessler blew a ring of blue smoke into the crisp air. He had perfected a lethal, terrifying maneuver against the B-25S. Knowing the bomber's heaviest defenses faced the rear and above, Kessler and his flight, the Schwarzenegger, Black Hunters, would climb high into the sun, racing far ahead of the bomber formations. Then they would pivot, point their spinners directly at the oncoming Americans, and dive head-on. The closing speed was nearly 600 miles an hour. It took nerves of absolute steel. In that terrifying 3-second window, Kessler would walk his 20mm nose-mounted cannon fire straight through the fragile, unarmored glass nose of the B-25, obliterating the bombardier and pilot before pulling up violently to avoid a mid-air collision. The Americans couldn't shoot back effectively. They just had to sit there and take it. "It is almost boring, Eric," Kessler chuckled, adjusting his silk scarf. "It is like shooting cows in a pasture. They cannot defend their faces. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, we will butcher another herd." Back in Corsica, Donovan sat in the debriefing tent, nursing a lukewarm cup of terrible coffee. The group commander, Colonel Harrison, was pacing at the front of the room, a cigar clamped firmly between his teeth. "We lost 3 ships today," Harrison growled, tapping a map of the Italian coast, "all to head-on passes. Intelligence says it's Kessler's boys again out of JG-53. They're sitting up there at 20,000 feet, waiting for us to hit the coastal rail lines, and then they drop the hammer." "With all due respect, Colonel," Donovan spoke up, his voice tight, "we're flying glass houses. If we can't get Mustang or Thunderbolt escorts down to the deck with us, we're going to keep losing crews. We have nothing to throw back at them when they come nose to nose. My bombardier almost bled to death over the Tyrrhenian Sea because our forward defense consists of harsh language and a pea shooter." Harrison stopped pacing and looked at Donovan. A slow, almost wicked smile spread across the colonel's weathered face. "I know, Artie. The brass knows. And that is exactly why you aren't flying the Carolina Reaper tomorrow." Harrison walked over to the flap of the tent and pulled it back. "Come with me. We had a delivery from the mainland while you were getting shot at." The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a burnt orange glow across the crowded airfield. Donovan, accompanied by Sammy and his top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Thomas Riker, followed Colonel Harrison to a heavily guarded revetment at the far end of the strip. Sitting on the tarmac were 4 brand-new, gleaming aircraft. At first glance, they were unmistakably B-25 Mitchells, the iconic twin tails, the gull wings, the robust tricycle landing gear. But as Donovan walked closer, his eyes widened in sheer disbelief. "What in God's name is that?" Sammy whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. Gone was the greenhouse plexiglass nose that had been the bombardier's office. In its place was a solid, blunt, unpainted metal fairing that looked like the snout of a pissed-off shark. Protruding from the center of this metal snout were the heavy, perforated cooling jackets of 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, stacked in 2 terrifying rows of 4. But that wasn't all. Flanking the lower sides of the fuselage, just beneath the cockpit windows, were aerodynamically shaped blister packs. Each blister held 2 more forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. "Gentlemen," Colonel Harrison said, patting the cold steel of the solid nose, "meet the B-25 J-11 Strafer, North American Aviation's answer to our little problem." Sergeant Riker, a greasy-handed mechanic from Detroit who loved guns more than he loved most people, let out a low, reverent whistle. He stepped up to the nose, gently running his calloused fingers over the cold gun barrels. "Colonel, are you telling me the pilot controls all of these?" "That is exactly what I'm telling you, Sergeant," Harrison replied. 8 in the nose, 4 in the side blisters. Plus, the top turret is locked to fire forward. That is 14 50-caliber machine guns, all wired to a single master firing button on the pilot's yoke. Donovan felt a shiver run down his spine. He did the math in his head. A Browning M2 fired around 800 rounds per minute. 14 guns firing simultaneously meant the aircraft could hurl roughly 11,200 half-inch, armor-piercing, incendiary rounds downrange in a single minute. It wasn't just a heavy bomber anymore. It was a flying broadside, a flying shotgun that could shred a locomotive or a steel-hulled ship in seconds. The armorers have been pulling their hair out all afternoon, Harrison continued. To feed this beast, they had to pack over 5,000 rounds of linked ammunition into the nose compartment. The plane is nose-heavy. She's going to fly like a pig, Artie. You're going to need a lot of trim to keep her level, and she'll drop like a stone if you lose an engine. But if anything gets in front of you, Harrison didn't need to finish the sentence. For the next 2 days, Donovan and his crew practically lived inside the new aircraft, which Riker quickly christened the lead sled. They took her up over the ocean for gunnery practice. Donovan would never forget the first time he pulled the trigger. He had lined up a floating wooden target pallet a mile off the coast. He flipped the master arm switch, rested his thumb on the red button on the yoke, and squeezed. The noise was not a rattle. It was a continuous, deafening, earth-shattering roar that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled Donovan's teeth in his skull. The cockpit instantly filled with the acrid smoke of burnt powder. A solid stream of alternating red tracers and white-hot incendiaries erupted from the nose, converging at a distance of 400 yards into a concentrated vortex of pure destruction. The recoil of 14 heavy machine guns, firing simultaneously, was so violent that the physical thrust pushed the 12-ton aircraft backward in the air. Donovan watched in shock as his airspeed indicator instantly dropped by nearly 20 miles per hour. The target pallet didn't just splinter. It ceased to exist, vaporized into white foam and matchsticks in a fraction of a second. "Holy Mother of God," Sammy gasped from the right seat, his eyes wide. Donovan released the trigger. His heart was hammering against his ribs. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. He looked out the window, looking north toward the Italian mainland. Let them come, he thought. Let Kessler and his boys try a head-on pass now. Meanwhile, in the opulent dining room of a requisitioned Italian villa near Verona, Hauptmann Dieter Kessler swirled a glass of expensive Barolo wine. The mood among the Luftwaffe pilots was boisterous. The Allies were pushing hard up the Italian peninsula. But in the air, the German fighters still believed they held the psychological edge. "I heard they are bringing in new bomber variants," Brandt noted, cutting into a piece of rare steak. A friend in intelligence intercepted some radio chatter. "They say the Americans are modifying the Mitchells." Kessler laughed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. "Modifying them how? Adding more armor? Let them. It will only make them slower. The Americans rely on mass production, Eric. They think they can win by simply blotting out the sun with cheap aluminum. But an elephant is still an elephant, and a wolf is still a wolf." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the B-25, the easiest Iron Cross a German pilot can earn." The table erupted in laughter and the clinking of glasses. Kessler took a sip of his wine, blissfully unaware of the mechanical monster that was currently sitting on the tarmac in Corsica, loaded to the brim with armor-piercing death. The Predator had grown entirely too comfortable. He had forgotten the oldest rule of the wild. Sometimes, the prey bites back. The briefing room at Alissan was suffocatingly hot, smelling of stale sweat, damp wool, and the heavy tension of impending combat. A large map of the Italian Riviera was pinned to the board, a thick red ribbon stretching from the sea to a heavily fortified rail yard near the coastal city of La Spezia. Major Thomas Bull Harding, the group intelligence officer, tapped a wooden pointer against the red ribbon. "Listen up, gents. Allied command needs this rail yard gone. The Krauts are staging Tiger tanks and artillery pieces here to move south to the Gustav Line. The yard is tucked in a valley, surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries on the ridges. High-altitude precision bombing is out of the question due to the cloud cover. We need to go in low, deck level." A collective groan rippled through the assembled air crews. Low-level runs meant flying right into the teeth of 20 millimeters and 37 millimeters flak cannons. Furthermore, Harding continued, his face grim, radar out of Naples indicates increased fighter activity in this sector. Jagja Schwader, 53. Kessler's outfit. They know our routes, and they know our tactics. You will not have fighter escort for the final 50 miles of the approach. Our P-47S don't have the legs to loiter on the deck that far north. Donovan exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Sammy. After the briefing, Donovan pulled Colonel Harrison aside. "Colonel, I want the lead element. Put the lead sled right at the tip of the spear." Harrison chewed on his unlit cigar. "You know what you're asking for, Artie. If Kessler is up there, he's going to target the lead ship. He always goes for the head of the snake to break up the formation." "I know," Donovan replied, his voice cold and steady. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. He thinks we're helpless from the front. Let's not disappoint his ego. I want to bait the trap." Harrison stared at him for a long moment, reading the quiet resolve in the young captain's eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Do it. Give them hell, Captain." At 0600 hours, a flight of 12 B-25s roared down the runway, their heavy engines clawing for altitude over the Mediterranean. Donovan led the formation, keeping the aircraft barely 50 feet above the rolling waves, to slip under the German radar for as long as possible. The sea spray occasionally misted against the windshield. Inside the cockpit of the lead sled, the atmosphere was electric. Sammy was hyper-focused on the engine gauges, while Donovan kept his eyes locked on the hazy horizon. Behind them, Riker stood in the top turret, rotating the twin 50S, scanning the sky. "Approaching the Italian coast in 10 minutes, Captain," the navigator called out over the intercom. "Copy that," Donovan said. He reached down and flicked a row of toggle switches on his center console. Clack, clack, clack. The red indicator lights illuminated. The forward guns were armed. The master safety was off. He rested his right thumb against the red firing button on the yoke. High above the clouds, completely invisible to the B-25S, skimming the water, Hauptmann Dieter Kessler was already in the air. He led a swarm of 4 Bf-109G, 6 fighters, cruising effortlessly at 18,000 feet. The sky up here was a brilliant, unblemished blue. "Control, this is Black Leader," Kessler transmitted, his voice calm. "We are on station, over La Spezia. Anything on the scopes?" Static hissed in his earpiece before the ground controller responded. "Black Leader, radar has picked up a low-level formation, approaching from the southwest. Sector Grid 7. Twin engines. Looks like Mitchell's attempting a deck-level strike." Kessler smiled behind his oxygen mask. It was almost too predictable. "Understood. Control. We are vectoring to intercept. Let us go hunting, boys." Kessler banked his Messerschmitt sharply, the powerful Daimler-Benz engine roaring as he pushed the nose down. He broke through the fluffy layer of stratus clouds and scanned the dark water below. It didn't take long. There they were, 12 olive-drab bombers, flying in a tight V formation, leaving white wakes in the ocean beneath them as they approached the coastline. "I have visual," Kessler called out. "Erich, you take the right flank. I will take the lead ship. Standard tactic. We hit them from the front, break their formation, and pick off the stragglers." "Understood, Dieter," Brandt replied, a hint of nervousness in his young voice. Kessler pushed his throttle to the firewall. The Bf-109 accelerated rapidly in the dive, the speedometer needle sweeping past 400 miles per hour. He swung out wide, circling around to get ahead of the bomber formation. He wanted to meet them perfectly head-on, giving them no angle to use their side gunners. Down on the deck, Riker spotted the glint of sunlight on aluminum. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, coming out of the sun." "I see them," Donovan replied, his voice unnervingly calm. Through the plexiglass windshield, he saw the 4 tiny black dots plunging toward them. They were executing the exact maneuver Kessler was famous for, getting out in front, turning, and setting up for the decapitation strike. "They're setting up for a head-on pass," Sammy shouted, gripping the armrests of his seat. "Artie, evasive action?" "Negative," Donovan commanded. "Hold formation. Everyone, tuck in tight. Do not break." "Artie, they're going to fly right down our throats," Sammy yelled. "Let them," Donovan growled, his eyes narrowing into slits. He adjusted his trim, keeping the nose of the heavy bomber perfectly level. He watched the dots grow rapidly larger, transforming into the sleek, deadly silhouettes of Messerschmitt 109S. He could see the yellow-painted noses of JG-53. In his cockpit, Kessler lined up the lead bomber in his Revy gun sight. The American was flying straight and true, an absolute sitting duck. Foolish, Kessler thought. He is paralyzed by fear. Kessler's thumb hovered over the cannon trigger. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Just a little closer, Kessler thought, waiting to see the glass nose of the bomber clearly, so he could walk his explosive rounds directly into the pilot's lap. But as the distance dropped below 1,000 yards, Kessler squinted through the gun sight. Something was wrong. The nose of the lead bomber wasn't catching the sunlight. It wasn't glass. It was a dull, flat gray. And there were dark, menacing protrusions sticking out of it. At a distance of 800 yards, Donovan's thumb pressed down hard on the red button. 14. Browning M, 2 machine guns, roared to life simultaneously, transforming the front of the B-25 into a blinding crown of muzzle flashes. Inside the cockpit, the noise was absolute and physically punishing. It wasn't a staccato rattle. It was a continuous, bone-jarring thunderclap that shook dirt from the ceiling panels and made the instrument needles dance wildly. Donovan fought the yoke as the immense recoil threatened to stall the heavy bomber, forcing the nose down against the sudden, violent backward thrust. Through the armored glass, he watched a terrifyingly beautiful phenomenon unfold. A literal river of red tracers and armor-piercing incendiary rounds, nearly a foot thick, reached out across the closing distance. The streams converged perfectly at 400 yards, creating a concentrated vortex of kinetic energy that defied comprehension. In his Messerschmitt, Hauptmann Dieter Kessler had less than a second to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. One moment, he was diving on a helpless, glass-nosed victim. The next, the entire front of the American bomber erupted in a wall of solid fire. There was no time to pull up, no time to roll, no time to even scream. The sky in front of him simply filled with lead. "Erich, break!" Kessler roared into his throat microphone, instinctively hauling his control stick back and to the right, violently abandoning his attack run. Blacking out under the sudden G-force, he felt his Bf-109 shudder as something massive ripped through the empty air where his cockpit had been a fraction of a second prior. "Lieutenant Erich, Brandt was not as fast, nor as lucky." Brandt, rigidly committed to the head-on pass, flew straight into the converging streams of Donovan's guns. A half-inch armor-piercing round travels at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When thousands of them strike a lightweight, aluminum-skinned fighter plane simultaneously, the result is not a crash. It is an obliteration. Donovan watched through the vibrating windshield as the young German's Bf-109 simply disintegrated. The engine block shattered, spewing a blinding cloud of vaporized oil and glycol. The left wing sheared off at the root, instantly engulfed in a fireball as incendiary rounds ignited the fuel tanks. Brandt's aircraft folded in on itself like crushed foil and vanished beneath the belly of the roaring B-25, raining, burning debris into the Mediterranean Sea below. "Splash one! Splash one!" Sergeant Riker screamed over the intercom from the top turret, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline. "Jesus Christ, Captain! You sawed him in half." There was no time to celebrate. The remaining 2 German fighters, shocked by the sudden, brutal annihilation of their wingman, scattered like frightened sparrows, completely abandoning their intercept vectors. The head of the snake had bitten back with lethal force, and the hunters were now entirely disorganized. "Keep them tight, Sammy," Donovan yelled, releasing the firing button. The sudden silence in the cockpit was deafening, replaced only by the steady, reassuring drone of the Wright Cyclones and the smell of sulfur and burnt oil. "We're pushing through. Target is 2 minutes out." Overhead, Kessler fought his crippled fighter for control. His violent, evasive maneuver had saved his life, but a stray, .50 caliber round had clipped his right wing spar, and another had punched a clean hole through his vertical stabilizer. The aircraft was vibrating terribly, threatening to shake itself apart. He looked over his shoulder, gasping for breath inside his oxygen mask. Where Brandt had been, there was only a slowly dissipating smear of black smoke. He watched the formation of American bombers, entirely unbroken, streak over the Italian coastline. They hadn't even altered their course. "Black leader to control," Kessler transmitted, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the stick. His arrogant, polished demeanor was gone, replaced by a hollow, cold terror. "Brandt is dead. The interception failed." "Black leader? Repeat?" The German ground controller crackled back, confusion lacing his voice. "Did the escort fighters drop on you?" "There were no escorts," Kessler shouted, slamming his fist against the canopy frame. The bomber. It had no glass in the nose. It was solid metal. It threw a wall of fire at us. I have never seen anything like it. Recall the swarm. Do not let anyone approach them from the front. Down on the deck, the topography shifted from open water to the rugged, terraced hillsides of the Italian Riviera. The 12 B-25S hugged the contours of the earth, screaming over olive groves and terracotta rooftops at 250 miles per hour. La Spezia rail yard. "Dead ahead," the navigator called out. Flak towers opening up. The sky ahead suddenly blossomed with ugly, black puffs of 37 millimeters anti-aircraft fire. The German gun crews on the ridges were tracking them, laying down a curtain of shrapnel. "All right, boys," Donovan said, his jaw set. "Let's show them what the lead sled was really built for. Going in." Instead of climbing to a safer altitude to drop their payload, Donovan pushed the yoke forward, dipping the B-25 perfectly level with a massive concrete flak tower guarding the southern entrance to the rail yard. He flipped the master arm switch again. "Suppressing fire," Donovan announced. At a distance of 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The 14 forward-firing machine guns unleashed hell once more. A torrent of lead lashed across the valley. From the perspective of the German anti-aircraft crews, it looked as though a localized hurricane of fire was sweeping toward them. The heavy, .50 caliber rounds chewed through the concrete parapets of the flak tower as if they were made of chalk. Sandbags exploded into dust. 20 millimeters cannons were ripped from their mounts, and the gun crews were entirely suppressed, forced to dive for cover or be cut to ribbons by the relentless strafing. Behind the protective umbrella of Donovan's staggering firepower, the rest of the B-25 formation roared into the rail yard unopposed. Bomb bay doors snapped open. Strings of 500-pound high-explosive bombs plummeted from the bellies of the aircraft with deadly precision. The earth heaved. Boxcars loaded with Tiger tank parts and artillery ammunition vanished in series of blinding, catastrophic explosions. Shockwaves rocked the lead sled, tossing the heavy bomber upward like a toy. But Donovan held her steady, his guns still blazing, chewing a path of absolute devastation through a line of parked locomotives. Boilers ruptured, spewing superheated steam into the inferno. In less than 90 seconds, the La Spezia staging yard was reduced to a smoking, cratered ruin. The B-25S banked hard over the burning wreckage, hugging the terrain as they sped back toward the safety of the sea, leaving a stunned, broken enemy in their wake. Silence hung heavy in the opulent office of Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Richter, the regional Luftwaffe commander. The walls were adorned with maps of the Mediterranean theater, pinned with dozens of red flags marking Allied advances. Richter stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the manicured gardens of the requisitioned villa. Sitting stiffly in a leather chair, Before the heavy mahogany desk was Hauptmann Dieter Kessler. His right arm was in a sling. His collarbone fractured during the brutal, terrifying crash landing he had managed to pull off in a muddy field, 20 miles south of Verona. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the confident ace who had mocked the Americans just a day prior. "A solid nose," Richter repeated slowly, turning away from the window. His voice was laced with profound skepticism. "You are telling me, Hauptmann, that a single twin-engine bomber, without escort, shot Lieutenant Brandt out of the sky, using forward-firing machine guns. Not just shot him down, Herr Oberstleutnant," Kessler said, his voice quiet but firm. "Vaporized him. I have flown against their fortresses and liberators. I know their defensive capabilities. This was entirely different. It possessed the firepower of a destroyer. It threw a wall of lead at us that was completely impenetrable. Our standard head-on tactic is suicide against this new variant." Richter sighed, walking over to his desk and picking up a silver lighter. He ignited a cigar, puffing thoughtfully. "Dieter, you are one of my best. You have the Knight's Cross, but combat fatigue can play tricks on the mind. The Americans do not build forward-firing gunships out of medium bombers. It is aerodynamically absurd. They must have had a P-38 Lightning tucked tight beneath them that you failed to spot in the glare of the sun." Kessler felt a surge of hot anger override his discipline. He stood up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his broken collarbone. "With respect, Herr Oberstleutnant, I am not blind, and I am not fatigued. I know what I saw. If you send the Schwarzjäger up against those Mitchells tomorrow, using the same tactics, you will be writing letters to their mothers by nightfall. The Americans have adapted. If we do not, we will bleed." Richter's eyes hardened. He slammed his hand flat against the desk. "Enough, Hauptmann. You lost your wingman because of a tactical error, or a hidden escort, and you are trying to blame it on a phantom superweapon to save face. You are grounded until the medical officer clears your shoulder. Dismissed." Kessler stared at his commander, a cold realization washing over him. The arrogance that had once fueled him was now destroying his superiors. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, suffocating on its own pride. Unable to comprehend the sheer industrial brutality the Americans were bringing to the fight, he offered a crisp, silent salute, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office. He knew, with absolute certainty, that more German pilots were going to die. 200 miles away, the mood at Allison Airfield was entirely different. As the lead sled touched down, the runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, and off-duty pilots. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew the formation had hit the rail yard on the deck and returned without a single loss. When Donovan cut the engines and climbed down from the forward hatch, a cheer went up from the crowd. He was exhausted, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his hands blackened with cordite residue, but a fierce, triumphant grin split his face. Colonel Harrison pushed through the crowd, clapping Donovan hard on the shoulder. "Captain, intelligence is reviewing the strike photos now. They say La Spezia is off the map. Complete destruction. And I hear you had a little run-in with JG-53? Sammy dropped down from the hatch behind Donovan, wiping grease from his forehead. "A run-in is putting it mildly, Colonel. Artie vaporized one of them. Took him right out of the air on a head-on pass." Sergeant Riker, climbing down from the fuselage, patted the soot-stained metal of the solid nose affectionately. "This girl is a meat grinder, Colonel." The Krauts didn't know what hit them. When the captain laid on the trigger, the flak tower just stopped existing. Harrison nodded, pulling a cigar from his pocket and biting the end off. He looked at the massive, heavy nose of the B-25, noting the blistered paint around the 14 gun barrels. "General Cannon called from HQ while you were up," Harrison said, his tone turning serious, though his eyes gleamed. "They've been testing these J models in the Pacific with Kenny's boys, but they weren't sure how they'd perform against hardened European flak defenses and elite fighters. You just gave them the answer." Donovan wiped his hands on a rag. "What's the verdict, sir?" "The verdict," Harrison grinned around his cigar, is that the 340th Bombardment Group is getting a lot more of these toys. Starting next week, we are changing our entire doctrine. No more running and hiding at 20,000 feet. We are going down to the deck. We are going to hunt their railyards, their convoys, and their flak batteries. Harrison looked up at the grim, soot-stained nose of the aircraft. Kessler and his boys thought they were the wolves, the colonel muttered, striking a match. Let's see how they like it when the sheep bite back. Autumn brought a bitter chill to the Mediterranean, graying the skies and churning the waters into white-capped fury. By November, the 340th Bombardment Group had completely transformed. The glass-nosed Mitchells of the past were gone, replaced entirely by a rampaging fleet of B-25J strafers. Word of Alva Donovan's devastating first mission had spread like wildfire through the Allied command, and the tactical doctrine shifted overnight. They were no longer just bombers. They were low-altitude executioners. Ground crews at Alissan Airfield had taken to painting snarling shark mouths on the blunt metal noses of the new aircraft, a fitting tribute to their predatory nature. The squadron was averaging 2 sorties a day, skimming the wave tops and darting through the Italian valleys to annihilate troop transports, armored trains, and supply depots. The 14 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns tore through anything the Third Reich tried to move by daylight. On the other side of the front line, the atmosphere within Jagdgeschwader 53 was toxic. Hauptmann Dieter Kessler stood on the freezing tarmac of a hidden airstrip near Trento, his arm finally out of its sling, though a dull ache persisted in his shoulder. He watched as the ground crews patched bullet holes in the wings of surviving Messerschmitts. The Schwarze Jäger were bleeding out. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Richter's refusal to acknowledge the new American threat had cost them dearly. Over the past 3 weeks, Richter had repeatedly ordered head-on intercept vectors against the low-flying Mitchells. The results were catastrophic. 8 experienced German pilots had been literally sawed to pieces in midair by the unprecedented wall of lead the B-25S projected. The Americans weren't just defending themselves. They were actively baiting the Luftwaffe into frontal assaults and then crushing them with overwhelming kinetic force. Another one lost today. Lieutenant Karl Weber, a replacement pilot who looked barely 18, murmured as he stepped up beside Kessler. He was trembling, and it wasn't just from the cold. Hoffman, he tried the diving pass over Bologna. They said the American bomber just pointed its nose up slightly, and the entire front of the plane erupted. Hoffman's engine block was pushed straight back into his cockpit. Kessler clenched his jaw, staring at his own Bf-109. The white victory marks on his tail suddenly felt meaningless, relics of a bygone era when the sky belonged to the gentlemen of the air. This was no longer aerial combat. It was an industrial meat grinder. Richter is a fool, Kessler stated flatly, not caring who heard him. He is fighting a war that ended a month ago. The Americans have turned those bombers into flying flak batteries. A harsh voice barked from behind them. Treasonous talk. Hauptmann Kessler. Kessler turned slowly to see Oberstleutnant Richter marching across the frost-covered grass, flanked by 2 adjutants. Richter wore a pristine leather coat, his face flushed with anger. I have tolerated your cowardice since your crash, Dieter, Richter snarled, stopping inches from Kessler. But I will not have you poisoning the morale of my new pilots. The Americans are relying on shock value. It is an illusion. A heavy, lumbering bomber cannot maneuver. If you hit them fast enough, they cannot track you. With all due respect, Herr Oberstleutnant, physics does not care about your theories. Kessler fired back, his aristocratic composure cracking. 14 heavy machine guns do not need to track you. They fill the sky. You cannot fly through a solid wall of lead. Richter sneered. Then I will prove you wrong myself. Intelligence reports a massive, Allied air armada forming over Corsica. They are targeting the Brenner Pass supply convoys. I am taking command of the intercept flight today. I will lead the charge, and I will show you how a true Luftwaffe officer deals with American parlor tricks. Kessler felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. It was a suicide mission, born of pure ego. "Sir, I beg you." "Silence," Richter roared. "Get in your aircraft, Hauptmann. You will fly on my wing, and you will watch how it is done, or I will have you court-martialed for cowardice in the face of the enemy." 2 hours later, the skies over the snow-capped peaks of the Italian Alps vibrated with the roar of radial engines. Captain Alva Donovan sat at the controls of the lead sled, his breath fogging the armored glass in front of him. Behind him stretched a terrifying armada, 36B, 25J Straffers, flying in a staggered, tight box formation, barely 500 feet above the jagged mountain terrain. "Target is 10 miles out, Artie," First Lieutenant Sammy Hayes called out, his eyes glued to the map. "Convoy of 60 trucks and 4 Panzer units winding through the gorge." "Copy that," Donovan replied, his gloved thumb resting lightly against the red firing button on the yoke. "Arm forward guns. Let's make this clean." In the top turret, Sergeant Thomas Riker swiveled his twin 50S, scanning the heavy gray clouds above them. "Captain, we got company. High 12 o'clock." Dropping out of the cloud deck, Donovan tilted his head back, squinting against the harsh winter light. 6 black dots were plunging toward them at a terrifying angle. It was a classic Luftwaffe ambush. "Hold formation," Donovan ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority over the squadron frequency. "Nobody breaks. Keep the noses level. Let them come to us." High above, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Richter pushed the throttle of his Focke-Wulf W-190 to the maximum, the powerful BMW radial engine howling as he entered a steep dive. He bypassed the traditional Bf-109 for the heavier fighter, believing its armor would protect him. He targeted the lead bomber, Donovan's lead sled, determined to shatter the American formation. "All units, on my mark," Richter commanded over the radio, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "Concentrate fire on the leader. Head-on pass. Break them." Flying slightly behind and to the left of Richter, Hauptmann Kessler watched the tragedy unfold in slow motion. He saw the blunt, shark-toothed snouts of the 36 Mitchells cruising steadily through the gorge. They looked like a school of prehistoric, armored beasts, unbothered by the predators diving from above. "Herr Oberstleutnant, pull up!" Kessler screamed into his microphone, panic finally breaking his icy reserve. "Look at their noses. Pull up!" Richter ignored him. The distance closed rapidly. 3,000 yards. 2,000. At 1,000 yards, Donovan saw the flash of the Germans' cannon ports opening up. He didn't flinch. He didn't evade. He simply pressed the red button on his yoke. The gorge below was a jagged scar, cut deep into the snow-capped Italian Alps, a narrow artery of stone and ice that the German military relied upon to bleed supplies southward. Captain Alva Donovan held the yoke of the lead sled with a grip like iron, his eyes scanning the treacherous, winding pass ahead. Behind him stretched a terrifying, unprecedented armada, 36B, 25J. Straffers flew in a staggered, incredibly tight box formation, their heavy radial engines vibrating through the freezing mountain air. They were barely 500 feet above the jagged terrain, casting massive, fleeting shadows over the snow. "Target is 10 miles out, Artie," First Lieutenant Sammy Hayes called out from the right seat. He didn't look up from his maps, his voice tight with the anticipated adrenaline of the strike. "Convoy of 60 trucks and 4 Panzer units winding through the gorge. They're bottlenecked near the bridge." "Copy that," Donovan replied, his breathing slow and measured. His heavily gloved thumb rested lightly, almost reverently, against the red firing button on the yoke. "Arm forward guns. Let's make this clean, boys." In the top turret, Sergeant Thomas Riker swiveled his twin 50S in a slow, continuous arc, scanning the heavy, bruised gray clouds that hung oppressively low over the peaks. The weather was deteriorating, but the threat wasn't just the ice. "Captain, we got company. High 12 o'clock. dropping out of the cloud deck. Donovan tilted his head back, squinting against the harsh, flat winter light piercing the canopy. 6 dark silhouettes were plunging toward them at a terrifyingly steep angle. It was a classic, textbook Luftwaffe ambush, executed with the precision that had once made them the undisputed masters of the European sky. "Hold formation," Donovan ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, uncompromising authority over the squadron frequency. "Nobody breaks. Keep your noses level. Let them come to us." High above the gorge, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Richter shoved the throttle of his heavy Focke-Wulf FAV 190 to the absolute maximum. The massive BMW radial engine howled like a wounded beast as he entered a terminal dive. He had deliberately bypassed the traditional, lighter Bf 109 for this heavier, armor-plated fighter, firmly believing that its thick cowl and reinforced glass would protect him from whatever parlor tricks the Americans were supposedly playing. He locked his Reeve gun sight onto the lead bomber, Donovan's lead sled, absolutely determined to shatter the center of the American formation and prove his subordinates wrong. "All units, on my mark," Richter commanded over the radio network, his voice dripping with aristocratic arrogance and misplaced confidence. "Concentrate fire on the leader. Head-on pass. Break their nerve." Flying slightly behind and to the left of Richter, Hauptmann Dieter Kessler watched the impending tragedy unfold in agonizing slow motion. His hands were slick with cold sweat inside his leather gloves. Through his canopy, he saw the blunt, unpainted metal snouts of the 36 Mitchells cruising steadily, unflinchingly through the gorge. With their painted shark mouths leering upward, they looked like a unified school of prehistoric armored leviathans, entirely unbothered by the predators diving from the clouds. They weren't scattering, they weren't taking evasive action, they were waiting. "Herr Oberstleutnant, pull up!" Kessler screamed into his throat microphone, the last remnants of his icy, calculated reserve finally shattering under the weight of pure panic. "Look at their noses! Pull up!" Richter ignored him entirely, his thumb shifting to the cannon trigger. The distance closed with terrifying, exponential speed. 3,000 yards, 2,000. The details of the American bombers became razor-sharp. At exactly 1,000 yards, Donovan saw the faint, rapid flashes of the German commander's 20mm cannon ports opening up. He didn't flinch. He didn't attempt to evade the incoming explosive shells. He simply pressed the red button on his yoke, pressing it down hard until it bottomed out. The gorge erupted in a cataclysm of sound and fire that defied human comprehension. Donovan's 14 heavy machine guns roared to life, instantly sending a blinding, concentrated stream of red tracers and white-hot incendiaries arching upward into the gray sky. But Donovan was not shooting alone. The wingmen on his left and right, along with the element leaders directly behind him, all squeezed their triggers at the exact same fraction of a second. Over 150 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The volume of lead pumped into the narrow, freezing airspace above the bomber formation was mathematically staggering. It was not a barrage. It was a localized, atmospheric anomaly of kinetic energy. A literal, solid ceiling of flying metal tore the freezing air to shreds. The sheer physical recoil of the massed guns was so immense that it visibly slowed the entire 36-ship bomber formation, the heavy 12-ton aircraft shuddering and groaning violently under the massive backward thrust. The sky turned gray with gun smoke, and bright red with intersecting tracer fire. Oberstleutnant Richter flew his heavily armored Focke-Wulf directly into the dead center of this mechanical maelstrom. There was no heroic, chivalrous duel. There was no brilliant exchange of piloting skill or daring maneuvers. Richter's heavily armored fighter struck the converging streams of half-inch armor-piercing rounds, like a fragile glass bottle being thrown into an industrial rock crusher. The Fu 190 simply stopped its forward momentum in midair, instantly shredded by thousands of simultaneous, high-velocity impacts. The reinforced canopy shattered into deadly dust. The wings were violently amputated from the fuselage in a shower of sparks, and the massive BMW engine detonated in a blinding, concussive sphere of orange flame. Richter was dead before his brain could even register the catastrophic, fatal failure of his own arrogance. Kessler, flying barely 100 yards, behind and to the side of Richter, watched his commander's aircraft vaporize into a horrific cloud of burning confetti and vaporized oil. The intense shockwave of the exploding fighter tossed Kessler's Bf-109 violently to the right. Operating purely on the instinct of a survivor, Kessler hauled back on the control stick with all his remaining strength, tearing his aircraft out of the suicidal dive. His vision went black at the edges as the tremendous G-forces crushed him deep into his seat. He pulled up, desperately leveling out parallel to the bomber formation, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to break its cage. 2 other German fighters from his flight hadn't been quick enough to react. They too were clipped by the staggering wall of defensive fire, their engines catching fire immediately. They spiraled down into the snow-covered mountains below, trailing thick, oily black smoke that stained the pristine white peaks. Kessler leveled out, gasping for air inside his oxygen mask. He looked to his right. He was flying perfectly parallel with the lead American bomber, separated by less than 50 yards of empty air. Inside the cockpit of the lead sled, Donovan released the firing button. The tremendous roar ceased, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the thick smell of cordite filling the flight deck. He looked out his side window, the glass vibrating from the engine torque, and locked eyes directly with the German pilot flying the black-nosed Bf-109. For 3 agonizing seconds, time suspended itself in the freezing air over the Alps. Kessler had a perfectly clean shot. He could simply kick his rudder pedal, point his yellow-painted nose at the highly vulnerable, unarmored side of the B-25's cockpit, and rake the 2 American pilots with 20mm cannon fire. His thumb hovered heavily over his trigger. He looked across the void at the American pilot, a young man with a grease-smudged, exhausted face and cold, unyielding eyes that stared back without a hint of fear. Then, Kessler looked down at the blunt, heavy metal nose of the bomber, painted with the mocking, bloody teeth of a shark. He thought of young Brandt. He thought of Richter's vaporized fighter. He thought of the sheer, terrifying industrial brutality that had managed to turn a vulnerable, glass-nosed medium bomber into an unstoppable apex predator. The war, he realized in that quiet, suspended moment, was already over. The sky no longer belonged to the gentlemen of Germany. It belonged to the machines of America. Kessler's thumb slipped off the firing button. He raised his gloved hand and offered a slow, deliberate, incredibly weary salute to the American pilot. Then, he kicked his rudder, banked hard to the north, and dove away into the thick cloud cover, abandoning the fight and leaving the gorge entirely to the Americans. "Bandit breaking off," Sammy yelled, bewildered and breathless, watching the German fighter vanish into the mist. "He had us dead to rights. Artie. He could have sawed us in half. Why didn't he shoot?" Donovan exhaled a long, shaky breath, reaching up to wipe a bead of cold sweat from his brow. "Because he's smart, Sammy," he murmured softly. "He knows when a game is over." "Target in sight," the navigator called out urgently from the rear compartment, breaking the tension. "Convoy dead ahead in the pass. They're trapped at the bridge." Donovan forced his trembling hands to steady on the heavy yoke, pushing the encounter from his mind. Below them, the German convoy was completely trapped on the narrow mountain road. Truck drivers and tank commanders were frantically abandoning their vehicles as the deafening, synchronized roar of 36 massive bombers echoed off the canyon walls like the trumpets of the apocalypse. "All right, boys," Donovan said, his voice returning to a cold, professional clip over the radio. "Let's finish the job. Bring the rain." The formation of 36 B-25J strafers dipped their noses in unison. The 14-gun broadsides of the lead elements opened up once more, instantly transforming the quiet, snow-covered valley into a churning, apocalyptic hellscape of shredded steel, burning gasoline, and shattered rock. The vital German supply line was systematically, brutally erased from the earth in a matter of minutes, leaving nothing but burning, twisted wreckage in the wake of the Iron Teeth. The era of the graceful, high-altitude dogfight had been murdered in the cold skies over Italy, replaced by a raw, thundering brutality that the old guard could never hope to match. The evolution of the B-25 Mitchell from a vulnerable medium bomber into the heavily armed Strafer variant marked a pivotal turning point in tactical air combat during the Second World War. By replacing the glass bombardier nose with a solid metal housing packed with 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns, and adding blister packs to the sides, Allied engineers created an aircraft that fundamentally altered the dynamic of low-level warfare. Enemy fighters, accustomed to exploiting the weak frontal defenses of bombers, suddenly found themselves facing an impenetrable, devastating wall of kinetic energy. The Strafer decimated supply lines, shipping lanes, and morale, proving that American industrial ingenuity could turn prey into an apex predator. This brutal adaptation saved countless Allied aircrews and effectively neutralized the standard intercept tactics of the Axis powers, securing the skies through sheer, overwhelming firepower.